There is a mansion on the edge of this city where no one laughs, where armed men stand at iron gates and luxury cars line the driveway like monuments to a life that looks perfect from the outside. Inside those walls lives a little boy who has everything money can buy, and one thing money cannot give him: his father. Tonight, that boy will ask a question so small, so quiet, that it should not have the power to bring an empire to its knees. But it will. Because the most dangerous man in this city is standing in the hallway, and he is listening to every word. If this story already has your heart, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The rain came in sideways that Tuesday evening, the kind of rain that didn't fall so much as a tack, driving hard against the tall windows of the Viscari estate, streaking the glass in long gray lines that made the whole world outside look like it was dissolving. Inside, the house was warm and lit and completely, utterly still. It had always been still. Elena Viscari had learned to live inside that stillness the way a person learns to live inside a scar. Not comfortably, not without pain, but with a practiced accommodation that eventually starts to look like peace if you don't study it too closely. She'd been doing it for 9 years. 9 years of marble floors she didn't choose and paintings she didn't pick, and a bedroom down the hall from a man who treated the bed between them like a border he had no interest in crossing. She was at the kitchen island when she heard Mason's feet on the stairs. The familiar, uneven rhythm of him, the left foot always hitting harder than the right, because he'd broken 2 toes on that side when he was 5, and they'd healed slightly wrong. She'd asked Dominic to take him to the specialist. Dominic had sent the driver instead. That was 3 years ago, and she still thought about it sometimes, in the involuntary way you think about things that quietly broke something in you. Mom. Mason appeared in the doorway. 8 years old, dark-haired, olive-skinned like his father, with eyes that were all Elena. Gray and watchful, and already carrying more than they should at that age. I was wearing the blue pajamas she'd bought him last month, the ones with the small anchors on them, and his hair was still damp from the bath she'd run 40 minutes ago. Hey, Bug. She opened her arm and he walked into it without hesitation, pressing his face against her side the way he'd done since he was 3 years old. She kissed the top of his head. His hair smelled like the lavender shampoo she kept in his bathroom, the one he pretended to hate, but that she'd noticed he always used down to the last drop before asking her to buy more. Can't sleep? She said. The rain's loud. It'll stop. You don't know that. She almost smiled. You're right. I don't. He stood there another moment, then peeled himself away from her side and climbed up onto one of the bar stools at the island, tucking his feet under him the way he always did, chin dropping to the cool granite surface. She went back to the mug of tea she'd been making, keeping her hands busy. The kitchen was large. All the rooms in this house were large. When Dominic had first brought her here, she'd thought she would grow into the space, fill it somehow. She understood now that some spaces are not meant to be filled. They are meant to make you feel small inside them. Dad didn't come home for dinner, Mason said. Elena didn't look up from her mug. He's busy. He's always busy. I know. Tommy Reeves's dad coaches his soccer team, Mason said. Not accusatory, just observational. The way children drop truth, like they're not sure what it weighs yet, like they haven't learned to be careful with it. That's great for Tommy. He comes to every game. Elena wrapped both hands around the mug. The ceramic was warm. She focused on that. Some dads are able to do that, and some dads have different kinds of jobs. What kind of job does Dad have? And there it was. The question she had been navigating around for years, around and around it, like a car on a roundabout that never takes an exit, just keeps circling. She had answers rehearsed for this question. She had 11 different versions of the answer, calibrated by age and circumstance, and how tired she was, and how much truth she thought his 8-year-old heart could absorb without cracking. Tonight she picked the one she always picked. Business, she said. He runs a very complicated business. Mason looked at her. She could feel him looking even without meeting his eyes. Anthony says his dad works in business too, but he still makes it to his school play. Different kinds of business, Bug. Right. Mason went quiet again. The rain hammered the windows. Somewhere deep in the house, one of the security staff made a round. The soft thud of footsteps moving from the west corridor toward the rear entrance, then fading. Elena had learned to track those sounds automatically. It was one of the 100 small habits this life had built into her without her permission. "Mom," Mason said. "Mm." His voice dropped. Not because he was afraid of being heard. She could tell that from his body language, the way he wasn't checking doors or lowering himself in any strategic way. He dropped his voice because what he was about to say felt tender to him. Private. Like something he'd been holding in his chest for a while and had only just decided to let out. "Why doesn't Dad love us?" The question hit her in the throat, not in the stomach the way questions sometimes do when they surprise you. In the throat, which is worse, because it took her voice with it. She stood there with both hands around a warm mug and her son looking at her with those gray eyes, and she could not speak for a moment that felt like it lasted several minutes. "He does," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended, rougher. "He doesn't look at us like Mr. Reeves looks at Tommy. People show love different ways. How does Dad show it?" She didn't have an answer. She tried to find one, sorted through 9 years of evidence like a woman searching through an empty room for something she was no longer sure had ever been there, and came up without anything solid enough to hand to her son. A house, safety, an absence of material suffering, things that were real but that a child of 8 couldn't hold in his hands and point to and say, "There, that's love." "He makes sure we're safe," she said finally. "He makes sure you have everything you need." Mason considered this with the seriousness he brought to everything, that old soul gravity that sometimes made her ache looking at him. Then he nodded slowly, in the way that meant he was accepting the answer as the only one available, rather than as one that satisfied him. "Okay," he said, "just okay." And somehow that word, that small, quiet word, was worse than the question. She got him a glass of water and walked him back upstairs, stood in the doorway of his room until his breathing evened out, and she was sure he was asleep, then went back downstairs and stood alone in the kitchen for a long time, listening to the rain. What Elena did not know, what she had no way of knowing, was that Dominic Vescari had come home 40 minutes earlier. He had not announced himself. He rarely did. There were men who made a production of their arrivals, who needed the gravitational pull of entering a room to feel real, and Dominic had always found those men exhausting and obvious. He moved through spaces the way he moved through business, quietly, efficiently, ahead of where anyone expected him to be. He'd sent Marco and Petit home before turning into the gate, which he did sometimes when he needed the drive from the car to the front door to be empty of other people's breathing. Tonight that need had been acute. He'd come from a meeting that had left a particular taste in his mouth. Not danger exactly, but the dry metallic edge of things that were about to become dangerous. And he needed 30 seconds of clean silence before he stepped back into whatever his house was going to require of him tonight. He'd come in through the side entrance, the one that bypassed the main foyer. Habit. The security team had nodded and gone back to their rotations without comment. He'd shed his jacket in the mudroom, rolled his left sleeve down to cover the fresh bruise forming along his forearm. He'd handled the door of a car harder than he'd meant to when Salazar's news had landed in his ears, and moved toward the kitchen. He'd heard Elena first, the soft movement of her, the faint clink of a spoon against ceramic. Then Mason's voice. He stopped at the turn in the hallway, still in shadow, 10 feet from the kitchen doorway. He hadn't intended to eavesdrop. He'd simply stopped. The way you stop when you're walking toward a sound and something in your chest catches before your feet do. He heard Tommy Reeves's father. He heard every game. He heard his son's voice, careful and curious and already practiced at absorbing disappointment without crying about it. And he heard his wife's answers, the hollow weight of them, the way she worked to fill in the space his absence created, smoothing it over and over with words that almost worked. He heard the silence before Mason's last question. And then he heard the question itself. Why doesn't Dad love us? Dominic Vescari had been shot 3 times in his adult life. Once in the shoulder at 26, once through the meat of his left thigh at 31, once grazingly across his ribcage 2 years ago in a parking garage in New Haven that had become a considerable problem for the people responsible. He knew what it felt like to have a bullet enter his body, the particular white-hot shock of impact, the way pain bloomed slow like ink dropped in water, spreading outward from the point of contact into every adjacent nerve. He would have taken any of those 3 bullets again, all 3 of them, without hesitation, if it meant he could unhear what his 8-year-old son had just asked in a quiet voice in their kitchen on a rainy Tuesday night. He stood in the hallway and did not move. He heard Elena's answer. He does. Rough. Quieter than she meant it. He knew that voice. The voice she used when she was holding herself together with both hands and needed to keep it from showing. He heard his son say, "Okay, just okay." He stood in the dark hallway for a long time after they went upstairs. He was not a man who sat with feelings. He didn't have the patience for it, and hadn't since he was a teenager, had built an entire life around action rather than reflection. But he stood there in the dark while the rain beat against the windows, and he did not move, and something inside him that had been calcified for years, insulated by necessity and distance, and the particular hardness a man builds when hardness is his only real product, cracked. Not shattered. Men like Dominic Vescari don't shatter, but it cracked, and that crack let something in. I was at the table when Elena came back downstairs. She stopped in the kitchen doorway and stared at him. He was sitting at the far end of the long dining table, jacket off, a glass of whiskey in his right hand that he hadn't drunk from. He could see from her face the work it took to reassemble her expression into something neutral. "I didn't know you were home," she said. "I came in quiet." She moved to the counter, turned her back to him, rinsed out the mug she'd been holding. "Do you need food? I can—" "No." He set down the whiskey. "Come sit down." "Dominic, I'm tired." "Elena." His voice was low. Not commanding exactly, but with enough weight behind it that she stopped moving. "Please." She turned. He could see the calculation in her eyes. The same calculation she always ran when he spoke directly to her, trying to identify the version of him she was dealing with. The one that needed something from the Empire, or the one that was going to ask something of her. She never seemed to know which one was coming, and the truth was that most of the time neither did he. She sat, not close, 4 chairs down from him. He didn't push it. "I heard him," Dominic said. The color left her face in a slow, steady way. "How long were you—" "Long enough." She folded her hands on the table. He could see the knuckles whiten. "Dominic, I'm not angry at you." That surprised her. He could tell from the way her shoulders shifted, a microsecond of release before the bracing came back. Elena had spent most of their marriage braced. He'd noticed it and had told himself for years that it was simply her temperament, that she was a cautious woman. Standing in the dark hallway 20 minutes ago, he'd understood for the first time with absolute clarity that she braced because of him, because she'd learned to anticipate impact. "I don't know what to tell you," she said. "You don't have to tell me anything." He picked up the whiskey, didn't drink it, set it back down. The ice had mostly melted. "I want to ask you something." "Okay." When did he start asking questions? Elena pressed her lips together. "A while ago. Small ones at first. Why you weren't at dinner? Why you missed the winter concert? Why other dads?" She stopped. Started again. "He's smart. You know how he is. He doesn't make a big thing of it. He just files it away. And then one day all those small things come out at once. Tonight. She looked at the table. "He didn't know you were home. He wasn't performing it for your benefit. He genuinely just wanted to know." She looked up. "That's the worst part, isn't it? That he wasn't even angry about it. He just wanted to understand." Dominic said nothing. He was looking at his hands on the table, big hands, scarred across the knuckles on the right, from a fight he'd been in when he was 22, a thin horizontal line across the left palm from a knife that had found him in an alley in the garment district a long time ago. Hands that had built something enormous and ugly, and that his son had never touched, except at formal dinners, when Dominic would briefly grip Mason's shoulder in a gesture that was supposed to convey affection, and probably conveyed something else entirely. "He asked me once if you were sick," Elena said. Her voice was quiet now, careful. "About 2 years ago. He said some kids' dads didn't live at home because they were sick and couldn't be around a lot. I told him you weren't sick." "What did he say?" "He said, 'Then why?'" Dominic exhaled. It came out rough. "I didn't have an answer," Elena said. "I gave him something. I always give him something. But I don't have the real answer, Dominic. I've never had it." She met his eyes. "Why don't you come home?" "I'm here." "You know what I mean." He did. He did know. He'd known for years and had been extraordinarily skilled at knowing it from a great distance, at a remove sufficient to not require any action on his part. He ran 23 people in 3 states. He had problems that needed his presence constantly, problems that would escalate without him, problems that used up every available hour of his attention and then asked for more. He had told himself that this was what the house was for, that maintaining this house, funding this life, keeping the walls up around his family, was itself a form of presence, that the security team at the gate was him, that the driver taking Mason to school was him, that the accounts that kept Elena from ever having to worry about a single material need were him, dispersed and protective, a version of himself that required nothing in return. He had told himself that story for 9 years. It sounded different now. It sounded like what it was. "I hear you," he said. Elena looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely decode, some mixture of exhaustion and something older, some remnant of the woman she'd been before all this, before she'd learned to flatten herself into whatever shape this life required. "Do you?" she said. Not accusatory, just tired. "I don't know how to—" He stopped. I was not a man who left sentences unfinished. He had always found it sloppy. But this one had no clean end. He wasn't sure where it was going. "I don't know how to be in this house the way you need me to be in it. I've never—" Another stop. He picked up the whiskey and finally drank some of it, more for something to do with his mouth than because he wanted it. "My father was not in the house either." "I know. I'm not saying that's an excuse." "I know you're not." She said it gently, which was almost harder than if she'd said it with an edge. They sat in silence for a while. The rain had softened from its earlier assault into something lower and steadier, a persistent percussion against the glass. One of the security men moved past the kitchen window on the exterior perimeter. Dominic tracked him automatically, clocked the timing, and was gone. "He has a school thing on Friday," Elena said finally. "The 3rd graders are doing some presentation about state geography. He's been working on it for 2 weeks. He drew this whole poster about the river systems." A pause. "He hasn't asked you to come." Dominic heard what was underneath that. "He hasn't asked because he doesn't expect you to say yes." "What time?" he said. Elena went very still. 2 o'clock. "I'll be there?" She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her deciding how much to let herself believe that. He understood the caution. He had missed things before, important things, with apologies that came afterward and were accepted in the thin way apologies are accepted when they've come too many times. He had no grounds to ask her to believe this was different. All he had was that it was. "Okay," she said. She went to bed shortly after. He stayed at the table. He thought about Mason's voice in the kitchen. The particular quality of a child's hurt when it isn't performed. When it's just quiet and real and accompanied by nothing but the sound of rain and his mother's careful answer. "He makes sure we're safe. He makes sure you have everything you need." True. Both of those things were true. They were also insufficient, and he had known that they were insufficient and had chosen them anyway because the alternative required him to be in 2 places at once, and he decided, without examining it closely enough, that the choice was obvious. That the empire needed him more than the house did, because the empire would die without him, and the house would not. He understood, sitting here alone at midnight, that this was wrong. The house was dying too, just slower, and quietly enough that it hadn't required his attention. I was at Mason's school at 2 o'clock on Friday. He arrived in a black car with Marco driving and Petit in the passenger seat and 2 additional men in a follow car, which he knew was conspicuous and which he could not entirely avoid. He hadn't moved without protection in 6 years, and he wasn't going to start now, not in a public place, not with Elena and Mason in the same building. He told the men to stay with the cars. He went inside alone. The gymnasium had been converted into a geography fair of some kind. Cardboard posters lined the walls, hand-lettered and illustrated by 8-year-olds with varying levels of ambition. Parents clustered in groups, coffee cups in hand, talking to each other with the comfortable ease of people who had been doing this for years and knew all the other parents by first name. Dominic moved through them like a man moving through water. Not hostile exactly, but with enough difference in bearing that people unconsciously made room. He found Mason's station near the east wall. Mason was standing in front of his poster, which was significantly more detailed than the ones on either side of it. River systems of the northeastern states, with small hand-drawn current indicators and labels in careful block printing. The kind of project a child undertakes when they're trying to impress someone and then keeps working on after they've given up on being seen by that person, just because the project itself has become important. Mason was talking to a red-haired woman Dominic didn't recognize, another parent, or perhaps a teacher's aide, explaining something about the Connecticut River watershed with the earnest precision he brought to anything he found genuinely interesting. He had his hands moving while he talked, the way he did, and his voice had that particular elevated energy he got when someone was actually listening. He hadn't seen Dominic yet. Dominic stood 12 feet away and watched his son explain river systems to a stranger, and felt something in his chest that he did not have an adequate name for. It was not pride exactly, though it contained pride. It was something rawer than that, something that had the quality of loss even though nothing had been lost, or maybe the quality of almost loss. The sensation of something you nearly dropped standing there in your hands while you think about how close the edge was. Mason turned, saw him. He went completely still. 8 years old, dark-haired, gray eyes wide open, hands dropping to his sides. The red-haired woman said something and Mason didn't answer her, just kept looking at Dominic from across the gymnasium floor with an expression that Dominic could not stand to look at because it contained too much, surprise and something tentative beneath it. Some small door opening that might close again depending on what happened next. Dominic crossed the floor. He stopped in front of the poster. He looked at it, actually looked at it, read the labels, followed the careful lines of Mason's drawn river currents. Connecticut River watershed, he said. Mason swallowed. Yeah, that's the longest river in New England. 407 miles, Mason's voice was careful, feeling out the ground under each word before he put his weight on it. It goes through 4 states. New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut. Something shifted in Mason's face. You knew that. I grew up 2 miles from that river. Dominic looked at his son. Fished it when I was about your age. Mason stared at him. You fished? I was a kid once. I know, Mason looked at the poster, then back at his father. You never told me that. Dominic crouched down so he was at Mason's eye level. He wasn't a man who crouched down easily. Not physically, which was fine, but in terms of what it required of him, the posture of it, the deliberateness, and he could feel the unfamiliarity of it in his whole body. I never told you a lot of things, he said. Mason looked at him, steady, gray eyes taking him in with that watchful intelligence that Elena always said came from her side of the family, though Dominic suspected it was something older than that, something that came from having to read rooms carefully from a very young age. You came, Mason said. I told your mother I'd be here. Yeah, but... A pause. The door in his face still open, still tentative. You usually can't. Dominic held his gaze. I know. I should have been able to more. Mason didn't say anything. He turned back to his poster and began explaining the watershed again, but this time to Dominic, pointing out the tributaries he'd researched, the elevation changes, the reason the river's flow slowed in certain places. He explained for 10 straight minutes without stopping, and Dominic listened to every word. In the follow car, Pettit watched the GPS tracker on his phone and thought about what Rico Salazar had said to him the week before. The boss is getting soft. You want to be there when it happens, or you want to be somewhere useful. Petit stared at the school entrance and said nothing. He had been with Dominic for 11 years. He knew things about the Vescari organization that no one outside it knew, had witnessed things he kept packed away in the back of his mind, in compartments he kept locked. He was loyal, had always been loyal, but loyalty in the organization Dominic ran was not a simple thing. It was a thing with weight and edge, a thing that could cut in any direction depending on how you held it. He put the phone in his jacket pocket. Through the school's glass front doors, he could see Dominic standing in front of a child's poster about rivers, listening. Pettit had worked for Dominic Vescari for 11 years, and he had never seen that particular posture on the man before. Open, still, completely without the defensive architecture the boss usually wore in any public space. He pulled out his phone again and looked at it. Thought about Salazar. Thought about what soft meant in a world where the wrong kind of weakness at the wrong moment got people killed. He put the phone away again and said nothing, but he kept thinking. That night, Dominic came home at 6. Elena was in the kitchen again. Mason was at the table, the river poster rolled up carefully beside him, working on what looked like homework. He looked up when Dominic walked in and did the same still moment he'd done at school, recalibrating, trying to read the situation, deciding whether to protect himself. Dominic went to the refrigerator. "What are you working on?" "Math." Mason watched him. "Division with remainders." "You need help?" Another still moment, the calculation that was heartbreaking to watch in an 8-year-old face. "Maybe," Mason said. Dominic sat down across from him at the table. He hadn't sat at that table except for formal dinners in 2 years. The chair felt unfamiliar. He looked at Mason's worksheet, long division, the kind with 4-digit dividends, and found a pencil in the cup Elena kept by the table and started walking through the first problem with his son. Elena stood at the counter and watched them and did not say a word. She was holding a spatula she didn't need yet. Her knuckles were not white. 40 minutes later, over dinner, Mason told him about the water cycle, about evaporation and condensation, and the difference between precipitation and collection. He'd been reading ahead in his science book, he said. They weren't covering that until next semester, but he'd wanted to know what came after rivers, where the water went when it got to the ocean. Dominic listened. He ate. He asked questions, real ones, because the child talking across from him was interesting in a way that he'd missed by being absent, a way that surprised him, like something arriving without warning. This particular person his son was becoming, with his careful hands and his river systems and his old soul eyes that had been carrying questions for too long. Elena caught his eye across the table once during dinner. He couldn't entirely read her expression. Some mixture of things. He didn't ask. After Mason went to bed, he sat at the table again. Alone this time. The rain had stopped. The house was quiet in a different way than it usually was. Not the heavy carved-out silence of a place people coexist in without touching, but something slightly less dense, something with a small crack of light in it. I didn't know, sitting there, that it had already begun. Not the softening, not the family he was slowly, haltingly, awkwardly trying to turn toward, but the other thing. The thing that happened when powerful men showed weakness in the presence of people who had built their positions on that man's strength and were not interested in watching it shift. He didn't know that 3 men had watched him in that school gymnasium today from positions he hadn't accounted for, that Salazar's reach extended into places he hadn't yet identified, that the picture of Dominic Viscari crouching down to look a child in the eye at a 3rd-grade geography fair had been photographed and transmitted before Dominic had even straightened up and walked out of the building. He didn't know that in a warehouse on the other side of the city, Rico Salazar had looked at that photograph and made a decision. He didn't know any of it. He sat at the long table in his quiet house and thought about his son explaining river systems, about Elena's face across the dinner table, the careful hope in it, the things she was trying not to show in case it made her too vulnerable to the next disappointment. About a question asked in a kitchen on a rainy night that had found him in the dark hallway with all his armor on and had gone straight through it anyway, clean as anything, finding the thing he'd thought was buried too deep to reach. Why doesn't Dad love us? He didn't have a clean answer for that. He wasn't sure he'd be able to explain himself, even to himself, if he tried. But he knew what the question had done to him. He knew what it had cracked open and that the crack wasn't going to close again. He knew that something had changed in him in that hallway. Not enough, probably not even close to enough, but real in a way that very few things in his life had been real. He was still sitting there at 11 o'clock when his phone buzzed on the table. He looked at the screen. Rico Salazar. He almost let it go. But he picked up because you didn't let calls from your underboss go. That was a different kind of message than he was ready to send tonight. "What?" he said. "We have a problem." Salazar's voice was smooth and level the way it always was, a voice engineered over many years for the specific purpose of delivering bad news without flinching. "You need to come in." "Tonight?" "I wouldn't call if it could wait." Dominic looked at the table, at the cup with the pencils in it, at the river poster rolled up against the wall where Mason had left it, planning to take it to his room tomorrow. "Give me the outline," he said. Salazar gave it to him. A supplier out of the tri-state network had gone missing, not run, missing, and the timeline put his disappearance at 36 hours ago, which meant someone had known about it and not told Dominic for a day and a half. That was the first problem. The second problem was where the man had last been seen, which was in a part of the city that should have been clean and wasn't, and suggested a breach in their operation that needed to be cauterized before it widened. Real problems, actual problems, the kind that did not wait for a man to finish having dinner with his family. He closed his eyes for 1 second, opened them. "I'll be there in 40 minutes, he said. He put on his jacket. He went upstairs and stood in the doorway of Mason's room. His son was asleep on his back, one arm thrown over the edge of the mattress, mouth slightly open. He breathed in the way children breathe when they're deeply under, even in full, and without any of the restless micro-movement of adults who carry their days into their sleep. Dominic watched him for a long moment. He did not touch him. He wasn't sure he had the right to yet. He went downstairs, past Elena's room, light still on, the thin line of it under the door, and stopped. His hand came up and rested against the door without knocking, just for a moment. Then he dropped it and walked through the house to the side entrance. Marco was already outside with the car. It was always running. The world Dominic lived in did not accommodate idle engines or pauses for sentiment. He got in. The gate swung open. The city swallowed him the way the city always swallowed him, completely, immediately, as though the house and the table and his son's breathing and the thin line of light under Elena's door had never existed at all. In the rearview mirror, the gate closed. He did not look back. He never looked back. But tonight, for the first time in 9 years, some part of him stayed inside those walls, standing in a dark hallway, hearing a small voice ask a question that had no clean answer, holding a crack in something that had been sealed a long time ago and was not going to seal itself again. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know. Driving through the city toward a meeting that felt routine, felt manageable, felt like every other problem he had ever solved, was that the man waiting for him in that warehouse had already made his calculations, had already decided what Dominic's softness was worth, had already set the pieces in motion, and that by the time Dominic understood what was actually happening, the thing he was only just beginning to turn toward would be the very thing used against him. The car moved through the wet streets. The city lights ran in orange lines across the window glass. And somewhere in a warehouse on the other side of those lights, Rico Salazar sat down across from 3 men who were not employees of the Viscari organization and laid a photograph on the table between them. A man in a dark suit crouching down to eye level with a dark-haired child in a gymnasium, and said, quietly and without ceremony, "Now you understand what I mean." The warehouse smelled like motor oil and standing water and something underneath both of those things that Dominic had learned to identify years ago. The particular odor of a space where men came to have conversations that couldn't happen anywhere else. Concrete floors. High ceilings with lights that hung on long chains and swayed slightly in the draft from the loading bay doors. 3 folding tables pushed together in the center of the space with laptops and paper maps, and 2 phones lying face up. Enrico Salazar standing at the far end with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, which was how Salazar always dressed when he wanted to look like a man who'd been working. Dominic had known Rico Salazar for 14 years. He knew his postures the way you know the tells of anyone you've spent that much time watching under pressure. The sleeves rolled up meant Salazar wanted to look busy. The jacket off meant he wanted to look approachable. Together, in this room, at this hour, they meant something Dominic filed away in the back of his mind without yet putting a name to it. "Tell me about Reyes," Dominic said. He didn't sit. He stood at the near end of the table with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the maps. Salazar came around the table. He moved with the particular economic grace of a man who'd grown up fighting in small spaces, compact, deliberate, nothing wasted. He was 41, sharp-faced, with close-cropped dark hair going silver at the temples, and eyes that had always reminded Dominic of the surface of still water, reflective, giving nothing away about the depth underneath. "Reyes was in contact with someone in the Hartfield operation 2 weeks ago," Salazar said. He put his finger on the map. "Here, this block. He used a clean phone we didn't know he had." "How do we know he used a clean phone if we didn't know he had it?" A short pause. "Because the Hartfield people got careless on their end. They used a number we'd flagged last year. So we have the Hartfield end of the conversation. Parts of it." "What parts?" Salazar turned and picked up one of the laptops, turned it toward Dominic. A transcription. "Partial. Long stretches of redacted black bars with fragments of dialogue on either side. Dominic read it twice. The fragments that weren't redacted were operational in nature, timing, location references, abbreviated shorthand that could mean a dozen different things without the surrounding context. Nothing specific enough to draw a straight line anywhere. This could be anything, Dominic said. It could be. But Reyes is gone. Men go missing. Not Reyes, not without telling someone. He was not that kind of man. Salazar took the laptop back. He had a meeting scheduled with Pinto yesterday morning. He didn't show. His apartment is clean. Not cleaned out clean, just clean, nothing disturbed, phone on the counter, food in the refrigerator. He walked out and did not come back. Dominic looked at the map. The block Salazar had pointed to was 3 miles from the Vescari distribution center on the east side, which was either coincidental or it wasn't. He traced the geography with his eyes without touching the paper. He'd learned not to touch things in rooms like this, not to leave the impression of his hands on anything he hadn't personally brought into the space. Who else knew Reyes had that meeting with Pinto? 4 people. Me, Pinto, Garza, and whoever Reyes told himself. Salazar paused. I haven't asked Garza yet. I wanted you here first. Why? Another pause, fractionally longer. Because if there's a breach, I want to know the shape of it before I start pulling on threads. Pulling the wrong thread in the wrong direction makes things worse. That was reasonable. That was also, Dominic noted, the kind of answer that sounds like caution and could equally be stalling. He filed that too. Get Garza in here, he said. Salazar made a call. 12 minutes later, a heavy-set man in a gray tracksuit came through the loading bay door looking like someone who'd been pulled out of sleep, which, if the call had just gone out, he had been. Garza was 47, ran the distribution logistics for the Eastern Network, and had been with the organization since before Dominic had taken over from his father. He was not a sophisticated man, but he was a consistent one, and consistency in this business was worth more than sophistication on most days. Boss, Garza nodded at Dominic, then at Salazar, a different nod for each. What happened? We're figuring that out, Dominic said. What did Reyes say to you last time you talked? Garza scratched the back of his neck. He'd been sleeping on it wrong, and there was a red crease there. 3 days ago, maybe 4. He called about the Bridgeport schedule, wanted to push the Tuesday window back an hour because of a thing with the dock workers. I said fine, that was it. Did he mention anyone he'd been talking to outside the usual contacts? No. Did he seem off to you? Garza thought about this with the genuine deliberateness of a man who doesn't perform thinking. Not off exactly. He was tighter than usual, like he had something on his mind. But Reyes always had something on his mind. You know how he was. Ran everything twice through his head before he said it. Tighter how? Just watching, more than usual. He kept the call short, which wasn't like him. He liked to talk through things. Garza shrugged one shoulder. I figured he was just busy. Okay. Dominic looked at Salazar. Get him out. Garza left. The loading bay door thudded shut behind him, and the draft it created made the overhead lights sway again, sending shadows rolling across the concrete floor. Salazar leaned against the table. You believe him? I don't know yet. Do you? I think Garza is too simple to run a double game. Salazar said it without condescension, just factual. He doesn't have the patience for it. That's what makes him useful, and it's also what makes him easy to use without knowing it. Dominic pulled out a chair and sat down, which was a departure from his usual operating mode in these rooms, and he knew Salazar noticed it. He was tired, not physically. Physically, he could run on 4 hours for a week if he needed to, but in some other register that had started announcing itself tonight with an insistence he couldn't route around. Go back to the Hartfield contact. How long have they been operating in that block? 8 months, give or take. And we've known about them for? 6 months. Dominic looked at him. We've known about a Hartfield presence 2 miles from our East Distribution Center for 6 months, and I'm hearing about it now. Salazar met his eyes without flinching. You were aware of the Hartfield situation. I briefed you in March. You mentioned Hartfield was moving into the lower corridor. You didn't tell me they were within operational radius of our eastern hub. The threat assessment at the time, I'm not asking about the threat assessment in March. I'm asking why the update didn't come to me when it changed. Dominic kept his voice level. He had long since stopped needing volume to make a point. Because the threat assessment clearly changed, Rico. A man who works for me is missing, and the last number he called traces back to people who are positioned 2 miles from one of our most critical operations. That's not the same situation as March. Salazar was quiet for a moment. Then, "You've had a lot on your plate." It landed wrong. The words were right. He had had a lot on his plate. That was factually accurate. There had been problems in the New Haven chain and a tax issue with one of their legitimate fronts that had consumed 3 weeks of careful attention. But the way Salazar said it had an edge that wasn't quite sympathy and wasn't quite anything else Dominic could name cleanly. "Don't manage me," Dominic said. "I'm not. You're deciding what I need to know based on some assessment of my capacity that isn't your job to make. Your job is to bring me the information. My job is to decide what I can handle." Salazar looked at him steadily. "Understood." "Good." The word sat between them. Salazar turned back to the maps. Dominic watched the side of his face and thought about 14 years, and whether 14 years was long enough to know someone, or whether it was exactly long enough to get very good at not knowing them. Well, he got home at 3:45 in the morning. Elena's light was off. He stood in the hallway outside her door for a moment, listening. Nothing. He went to his own room, which was large and impeccably maintained by the household staff, and as anonymous feeling as a hotel, and sat on the edge of the bed without taking his jacket off. He sat there for a while, not thinking exactly, just existing inside the information he'd absorbed in the last 4 hours and letting it settle into whatever shape it was going to take. Reyes missing. Hartfield in the corridor. Salazar's timeline not quite adding up in ways that were individually explainable and collectively uncomfortable. He thought about the photograph. The one he didn't know existed yet. The one taken in the gymnasium, transmitted before he'd even straightened up from crouching beside his son's river poster. He thought about it the way you sometimes think about the thing you don't know you should be thinking about. A formless unease that doesn't have a specific object, but that your body registers before your mind catches up. He took off his jacket. He lay down on top of the covers without undressing and stared at the ceiling until the darkness outside the windows began to gray. 3 days passed. In those 3 days, Dominic came home for dinner twice, which was 2 more times than his previous monthly average. He helped Mason with a book report on Tuesday evening, sitting at the kitchen table for 2 hours while Mason dictated his thoughts, and Dominic wrote them out in language that was 8-year-old enough not to be suspicious and organized enough to actually constitute a report. He and Elena did not talk about the night he'd heard Mason's question, or about the dinner they'd had where Mason explained the water cycle, but those things existed between them now in the way that things exist when they've been named, present, with weight, requiring some eventual reckoning. On Wednesday evening, Elena was doing dishes when Dominic came into the kitchen and stood at the counter with 2 inches of physical space between them, which was close by their standards, and she didn't move away. They talked about Mason's book report, about the science fair coming up in a month, about a crack in the pool surround that needed to be looked at before summer, small logistical things, the mundane scaffolding of a shared life, and the fact that they were talking about them at all was different enough from the preceding years that Elena's hands slowed in the dishwater. "You seem tired," she said. "I'm fine." "That's not what I said." He looked at her. She was still facing the sink, hands moving through the soapy water, finding the edges of things. "There's something at work," he said, which was the version of the truth available to him in this context. "I'm handling it." "Is it the kind of thing that—" She stopped, reconsidered. "Should I be worried?" The honest answer was that he didn't know yet. The answer he gave was no. He said it cleanly, without hesitation, because he believed it was more likely to be true than not, and because the alternative, loading her with the specific shape of his concern when it didn't yet have a specific shape, would accomplish nothing except putting fear in her that she couldn't act on. She nodded and went back to the dishes. He watched her for a moment. The line of her shoulders, the way she'd pulled her dark hair back loosely, the fact that she was wearing a sweatshirt he vaguely recognized from several years ago, something she never would have worn if she'd known he was coming home. She was real in the kitchen the way she was never real in any other context of their life together, not performing it, just in it. Elena. He didn't know what he was going to say when he started. He almost stopped there, at her name, and left it. She turned, looked at him. I know this isn't. He pressed his mouth together, started again. I know what this has been, what I've made it. He held her gaze. I'm not saying it fixes anything to say it. She was quiet for a long moment. Her expression was complicated in the way expressions are complicated when someone has been waiting for a thing long enough that the arrival of it is not simply relief. Why now? She said. Because I heard my son ask why his father doesn't love him. Her eyes went sharp and soft at the same time. She turned back to the sink. Okay, she said quietly, into the middle distance. He left it there. He didn't know how to do more than that yet, and he'd learned enough in the past week to understand that doing more than he was capable of doing was worse than doing less. She knew that too, probably. She'd been reading him accurately for 9 years. On Thursday, Pettit came to him. Not in the warehouse, not through Salazar, not in any of the usual channels. Pettit called Dominic's personal cell, the number that exactly 4 people had, at 11 in the morning, while Dominic was at the legitimate real estate office on Morrison Street that served as one of the organization's cleaner public faces. He said he needed 10 minutes. He said he needed it without Salazar knowing. That last part was what made Dominic step out of the office and into the parking structure next door and stand between 2 concrete pillars in the dimness, phone to his ear, and say, "Talk." Pettit talked. He'd been careful. That was the first thing Dominic noticed. The deliberate, almost painful carefulness of a man who had been turning something over for a long time before deciding to say it out loud. Pettit was not a reckless man. He was not given to drama or over-calculation. He drove, he watched, he kept his mouth shut. In 11 years, he had not once come to Dominic with something that turned out to be nothing. There was a second car at Mason's school, Pettit said, parked on the service road on the south side of the building. Dark blue, no plates, 2 men inside. I made them when we pulled in, but I didn't say anything because they stayed put, and I wasn't sure. Dominic's hand tightened on the phone. He kept his breathing even. When did you decide you were sure? When I saw one of them take pictures, through a long lens, of you inside the gymnasium. A pause. Of you and Mason. The concrete pillar in front of Dominic was rough and gray and cracked along one edge, a thin dark fissure running from floor to ceiling. He looked at it. You recognize them. The driver. From a distance, but yes. He worked the east side for Salazar about 2 years ago, before he went private. Went private was a phrase they used for men who left the organization's direct payroll and continued to do work for it through less official arrangements. Men who went private were still connected. They just weren't on paper anymore. You've sat on this since Friday, Dominic said. I had to be sure. I kept running it, trying to find another read on it. There isn't one. Pettit's voice was low and absolutely steady. He was scared. Dominic could hear the particular flatness that fear produced in men who were good at controlling it, but he was steady. I'm sorry it took me this long. Who have you told? No one. Just you. Dominic turned away from the concrete pillar and looked at the parking structure exit, the thin rectangle of gray daylight at the end of the row. Stay close to home base, he said. Don't change your patterns. Don't let anyone see that anything has changed. Understood. And Pettit, he paused. Don't be alone anywhere for a while. He ended the call and stood in the parking structure for a moment, very still, while everything he'd been thinking for 4 days about the shape of the thing reassembled itself around this new piece. And the shape it made now was not ambiguous. It was not a thing with multiple reads. It was a clear structure, ugly and familiar. He'd seen versions of it before, had been on the other side of it in his younger years, had helped design operations that had the same basic architecture. Identify the target's vulnerability, surveil the vulnerability, wait for the right moment to use it. The target was him. The vulnerability was in a school gymnasium explaining river systems with his father for the first time. Rico Salazar had been planning this for longer than Dominic had been paying attention. He drove to the warehouse on the east side without calling ahead. That alone was enough to put tension in the room when he walked in. Salazar was at the table with 2 men Dominic recognized from the distribution network, laptops open, what looked like a supply chain conversation that stopped mid-sentence when Dominic came through the door. The 2 men read the air and found reasons to be somewhere else within 30 seconds. Salazar stayed. You should have called, Salazar said. Not aggressive. Measured. I know. Dominic pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. He put both hands flat on the table. Tell me about Reyes. We've been over... Tell me again. Salazar looked at him. The still water eyes doing their thing, surface flat, nothing showing underneath. We still don't have a location. The Hartfield connection is being... Stop. Dominic kept his voice quiet. He'd found over the years that quiet was more effective than loud in small rooms. Loud was for crowds, for demonstrations. Quiet was for the moment you needed a man to understand that you meant exactly what you were saying. Stop running the play, Rico. A pause. Short. The kind that costs something. I don't know what you mean. Yeah, you do. Salazar held his gaze. He was good at this, had always been good at this. That particular stillness that read as confidence and could equally be the composure of a man who's already done his calculations and knows which way they fall. Dominic had admired it once. He'd called it coolness. Sitting here now, looking at it with fresh information behind his eyes, he understood it differently. The men at Mason's school, Dominic said. Something moved across Salazar's face, fast, gone. I don't know what... The driver. East Side work, 2 years ago, went private. He's yours. Dominic did not look away. The photographs. The long lens. All of it. The room was very quiet. Somewhere in the building, something mechanical was running. A generator maybe, or a ventilation unit. A low constant vibration under the silence. Salazar sat back. He did it slowly, and the slowness of it was its own kind of answer. He looked at Dominic across the table with the still water eyes and said nothing for a long moment. And in that moment, Dominic understood that they had crossed from one territory into another and that there was no pretending it hadn't happened. You're getting soft, Salazar said. The words were quiet. They were not a taunt. They were delivered with the flat certainty of a man stating something he had already decided was fact, a conclusion he'd arrived at through careful deliberation over a significant period of time and was now prepared to defend. You think watching my son at a school fair makes me soft. I think letting it change how you operate makes you soft. I think coming home for dinner makes you soft. I think... Salazar leaned forward now, elbows on the table, voice dropping further. I think you built this in 20 years and you're going to walk away from it because a kid asked you a question in a kitchen. And that's soft. And soft gets people killed. People who work for me, Dominic said. People who depend on this organization to function. Yes. Salazar's jaw was set. This is not personal. No, it is absolutely personal. What you did at that school was personal. Dominic stood up. You photographed my son. I documented a liability. The word landed in the room like something thrown. Dominic looked at him. Say that again. Your family is a liability, Dominic. They have been for years and you chose not to see it because it was convenient not to see it. That's over now. You started making it real, bringing it in, letting it count, and now it can be used. That's not my doing. That's the consequence of your choices. Dominic looked at the man across the table who had sat to his left for 14 years at every significant table in every significant room, and had been, he'd believed, as close to an ally as this business allowed. He looked at him and did not feel rage exactly, though rage was part of it. He felt the particular cold clarity that comes when a long confusion resolves into something stark and simple. You're going to want to be very careful about what comes next, Dominic said. I know exactly what comes next. Salazar met his eyes. So do you. Dominic walked out. He did not run. Running was fear, and fear was information he wasn't prepared to give the room. He walked through the loading bay, out into the flat gray daylight, and got into the car. Home, he said to Marco. Marco pulled out without a word. He'd worked for Dominic long enough to read a room from the set of a man's shoulders. In the back seat, Dominic looked out the window and thought about what Salazar had said. Liability. He thought about the photograph taken through a long lens while he crouched down to look his son in the eye. He thought about the word documented. He thought about 14 years and the specific architecture of betrayal, how it required time and patience and the close study of the thing you intended to use, which meant Salazar had been watching, had been building this, and that the trigger for it was not Dominic's weakness but Dominic's change. It wasn't that he'd gotten soft. It was that he'd started to matter to something outside the empire. And that something was now leverage. He called Elena. She picked up on the second ring, background noise. She was somewhere in the house. He could hear the faint sound of the television Mason liked on Saturday mornings. "Hey," she said, surprised. He almost never called during the day. "Where's Mason right now?" Her voice changed immediately. Not panic. Elena was not a panicking woman. But that shift from normal to alert, the one she did when she read something serious in his. "He's right here, with me. Keep him inside today. Keep both of you inside. Dominic, I'm coming home. I'll explain when I get there." He ended the call. He looked at the city going past the window. The familiar streets, the blocks he'd walked and worked and owned pieces of for 2 decades. The geography of a life that was entirely visible in one direction and entirely invisible in another. And understood, with the cold clarity still sitting in his chest, that the thing that had cracked open in the hallway on a rainy Tuesday night had changed the entire equation. He had something to lose now. He was letting himself have something to lose. And somewhere in a warehouse on the other side of the city, a man who had worked beside him for 14 years was sitting with photographs of that something and deciding exactly how to use them to take everything else. The car turned onto the highway. Mason's school had a fall event on Friday, an outdoor field day, students and parents on the open athletic grounds. No controlled entry after the first 30 minutes, mixed crowd, public access from the parking lot on the east side. Dominic had approved the security arrangements for it himself 2 weeks ago, before any of this had taken its current shape. He pulled out his phone to call it off. It rang before he could dial. Unknown number. He answered because in his world, unknown numbers were sometimes the most important ones. Silence on the other end. Then a sound that stopped the air in his lungs completely. Small, distant, frightened, unmistakable. Mason's voice saying, "Dad?" Just that. One word. And then the line went dead. The phone was dead in his hand and the car was still moving, and for 3 full seconds, Dominic Viscari did not breathe. Marco felt it from the front seat, felt the quality of the silence change, the way silence in a car changes when something has happened to the person behind you, the way air pressure shifts, and glanced in the rearview mirror without saying anything. He'd worked for Dominic long enough to know that the wrong word at the wrong moment cost more than no word at all. Dominic called Elena. It rang 4 times. 5, 6, voicemail. He called again. Same result. "Marco," his voice came out flat and without color. "Turn around." Marco was already turning. Dominic called the gatehouse at the estate. One of the security team picked up on the second ring. Voss, the afternoon shift lead, a former military man who ran his rotation with the kind of procedural discipline that Dominic paid for specifically. "Talk to me," Dominic said. "Everything's quiet, sir." Then a half-beat hesitation, the kind that contains information. "Mrs. Viscari left about 20 minutes ago." "Left?" "With Mason. She said she was taking him to his—" "I assumed you knew, sir. She said it was a school thing. She had the regular—" Voss stopped, recalibrated. Dominic could hear him doing it, the quick internal audit of a man realizing the context had shifted. She had the regular car. Harmon was driving. Harmon. Not Marco. Not Petit. Harmon, who was new, who had come in through the staffing agency 4 months ago, who had been vetted through Salazar's office because Salazar handled personnel intake, and Dominic had signed off without examining the file personally because he'd been in New Haven dealing with a problem that now seemed, in retrospect, to have been engineered specifically to occupy his attention during a particular 4-week window. "Get everyone on the grounds," Dominic said. "Lock the gate. Nobody in or out until I'm back." He ended the call. He looked at his phone. He thought about Harmon's personnel file and the 4 months and the New Haven problem in the warehouse this morning, and Salazar's face when he said liability, and the photograph taken through a long lens on Friday, and the architecture of it assembled itself completely in his mind in the space of about 8 seconds. The whole structure of it, how long it had been building, how many pieces had been moved into position while he was looking somewhere else. It had not been 4 months in the making. It had not been 6 months. What Salazar had been built over a period of at least 2 years, possibly longer, and Dominic had not seen it because he had not been looking, because he had been present in the organization and absent from everything else, and the space he'd left in everything else had been filled by the man he trusted most, and that man had used the fill to build the thing that was now closing around him. Petite, he said. Pettit picked up immediately. He'd been waiting. Boss, do you know where Harmon was before us? A pause. Not uncertainty, retrieval. Salazar brought him in. I flagged it at the time because the intake looked thin. The agency he came through, I ran it, and it only had 6 months of history online. You flagged it. To Salazar. Dominic closed his eyes for 1 second, opened them. Where would Salazar take them? I don't know. Think. I'm thinking. Pettit's breathing was audible, controlled but working. He has the warehouse on the east side. He has the facility in Bridgeport. He has a pause. There's a place. An old steel processing plant off Route 9, about 40 minutes north. He used it once 3 years ago for a situation with the Mercer people. It was off book. I only knew about it because I drove. Send me the location. Already sending. The phone buzzed with the pin. Dominic looked at it. 40 minutes north. He looked at Marco. Route 9. The old steel plant. Go. Marco went. He ran 2 lights and got onto the highway entrance at a speed that pushed Dominic back against the seat, and neither of them said anything about it. Dominic called 3 men. Not through the usual channels, directly, personal numbers, men whose loyalty he was certain of, in the way you can be certain of very few things, which meant he was working with a short list. Carver. Diaz. And after a moment's pause, Pettit himself, who was already moving by the sound of it. Armed and quiet, Dominic told each of them. No communication through the regular network. Just your phone. Just me. He gave them the location. Then he sat in the back of the car as Marco drove north and thought about his son's voice on that phone. Just the one word. Dad. The way it had sounded. Not a cry, not a scream, quieter than that. The voice of a child who had been told to say the word and nothing else, or who had managed only the one word before the phone was taken away. Either version was something he couldn't hold in his mind directly, so he put it in a compartment and locked it, and did not look at it because if he looked at it, he would not be functional, and he needed to be functional. He thought instead about Elena, about whether she'd gone willingly, a ruse, a pretense, Harmon telling her something that got her out of the house, or whether she'd understood at some point in the car what was happening. He thought about her face when she read things in him, that accuracy she'd developed over 9 years, and thought she'd probably understood faster than Harmon had anticipated. Elena was not a woman who missed things. She had just spent most of their marriage choosing not to react to them. He thought about what Salazar had said. I know exactly what comes next. The certainty of it. The man had been calm in a way that was not the calm of someone improvising. It was the calm of someone who'd already rehearsed the sequence. The highway opened up north of the city, and Marco pushed the car to 90 and kept it there. They were 12 minutes out when Dominic's phone rang. Salazar. He let it ring twice, then picked up. You drive fast, Salazar said. He sounded like himself. That was the thing that hit Dominic in the sternum. He sounded completely like himself. The same flat, measured voice that had sat to his left for 14 years, unchanged. We need to talk before you do something that makes this permanent. It's already permanent. It doesn't have to be. A pause. Pull over. No. Dominic. A fractional shift in the voice. Not softer, more deliberate. You have about 30 men who are loyal to you and 60 who are loyal to whoever is running the organization competently. That's not personal. That's math. If you come in here with 3 or 4 guys and a lot of anger, you're going to get people killed, including people you don't want to get killed. If my son has a mark on him, the boy is fine, the woman is fine. Still calm. Still that surface of still water calm. They'll stay fine if you listen to what I'm saying. Dominic's jaw was tight enough that he could feel it in his back teeth. He made himself breathe. He made himself think, because thinking was the only asset he had that Salazar hadn't yet found a way to compromise. What are you saying? I'm saying this organization cannot survive you going domestic. I'm saying you've been building something for 20 years, and it requires full attention and full commitment. And you've already demonstrated in the last 2 weeks that you're not going to give that, which means someone else needs to. A pause. I'm not your enemy. I am managing a transition that you made necessary. You took my son. I removed the thing that was going to get you killed. Your son, walking around in public with inadequate protection because you wanted to feel normal, is a vulnerability that every organization competing with ours has now identified. I moved him to a controlled location. That's not a kidnapping. That's a security operation. The language was extraordinary. The smoothness of it. The way he turned each fact until it faced in the direction he needed it to face. Dominic had watched Salazar do this to other people for years. From the outside, it was almost beautiful. The precision of it, the economy. From the inside, it felt like standing in a room that was slowly being repainted around you while someone told you the color had always been this way. What do you want? Dominic said. Step back. Officially and cleanly. Sign the transition. Let me run the organization the way it needs to be run and take your family somewhere quiet and be the father you apparently want to be. Nobody gets hurt. Everybody gets what they want. And if I don't? The pause this time was different. Not deliberate. Genuine. And that genuine pause told Dominic more than anything Salazar had said in the last 3 minutes. Then this gets complicated. And complicated has costs. I don't want those costs any more than you do. I'll call you back, Dominic said. Don't take... He ended the call. He sat for a moment with the dead phone in his hand. Marco was still doing 90. The landscape north of the city was industrial, giving way to scrub. Flat gray land with low trees and the occasional skeletal structure of something that used to manufacture something and didn't anymore. Boss, Marco said, keep going. He called Pettit. What do you know about the plant's layout? 2 buildings. Main structure. The processing floor. Big open space. Old equipment still in place. Secondary building to the east. Smaller. Used to be offices. If he's keeping them somewhere controlled, it's the secondary building. Easier to manage, fewer entry points. How many men does Salazar typically move with? Depends on the operation. For something like this, Pettit paused. 8 minimum. Probably more. Carver and Diaz? 10 minutes behind you. Dominic thought. He had Marco. He had Pettit 10 minutes out. Carver and Diaz another 10 behind that. 4 men. Against 8 minimum, in a location Salazar had chosen, in a building Salazar knew, and he didn't. He knew those odds were bad. He also knew that Salazar had told him about the call, had called him directly, which meant Salazar didn't want to fight. He wanted the signature, the clean transition, the abdication on paper that would give him legal standing inside the organization's internal structure, which was, when you stripped everything else away, the actual thing this was about. Not eliminating Dominic, owning what Dominic had built, which meant Dominic's family was leverage, not targets, which meant they were safe as long as he hadn't yet refused. He hadn't refused. He'd said he'd call back. That was a window. Small. He needed to use it correctly. Marco pulled off Route 9 onto a service road that went through a stand of low trees and came out into an open lot in front of a large industrial structure. Rust and broken concrete and tall weeds coming up through the asphalt. The steel plant. The main building was a long, low structure with a sawtooth roof, half the panels missing, open to the sky in sections. The secondary building, smaller, brick, windows mostly intact, sat to the east connected by a covered walkway. 3 vehicles in the lot, 2 black SUVs and a panel van. Dominic counted heads and locations from the car before Marco stopped rolling. 4 visible men at the main entrance to the secondary building, at the corner of the main structure, and 2 near the vehicles. Positions that covered the obvious approach vectors. Positions set by someone who knew what they were doing. Stop here, Dominic said. Don't get out. He got out. He left his jacket in the car. He walked across the lot with his hands visible and his pace measured, and he watched the men at the secondary building entrance track him without moving. When he was 20 feet out, one of them raised a hand. That's close enough. I need to see them, Dominic said. You need to call Mr. Salazar. I'm not calling Salazar. I need to see that my family is unharmed, and then I'll talk to whoever I need to talk to. That's the only conversation I'm having. He held the man's gaze. You know who I am. The man, young, ex-military by his posture, someone Dominic didn't recognize from his own payroll, held for a moment, then spoke quietly into a radio. There was a wait. Then the building door opened and Salazar came out. He looked the same as he had in the warehouse 3 hours ago, jacket still off, sleeves still rolled. He stood in the doorway and looked at Dominic across the 20 feet of cracked asphalt. "You came alone," Salazar said. "I came to see my family." "And then?" "And then we talk." Dominic kept his voice level. "Let me see them." Salazar considered this for a moment, or appeared to consider it, though Dominic suspected the consideration was performative, that the decision had already been made, that this was theater with a predetermined script. Then he stepped aside and said something to someone inside the building, and Elena came through the door. She was walking under her own power, no visible injuries. She looked at Dominic with the expression of a woman who had, in the last 2 hours, processed a significant amount of information about her life, and arrived somewhere past the shock of it into something cooler and harder on the other side. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were doing the thing they did when she was frightened and refusing to show it. "Mason," Dominic said. "He's inside," Elena said. "He's okay. He's scared." "Did they hurt him?" "No." Her voice was tight. "Harmon told him it was a surprise for me. He didn't understand until—" She stopped. Her throat moved. "He's asking for you." Dominic looked at Salazar. "Bring him out." "That's not how this works," Salazar said. "Bring him out or this conversation ends." "The conversation ending has consequences, you—" "Rico." Dominic said his name quietly, just the name. The way you say someone's name when you want them to understand that the performance is over and you're talking directly now. "Bring my son out." Something moved in Salazar's face. A small recalibration. The recognition that the man in front of him was not operating from fear, or at least not from fear alone, and that the playbook he'd written assumed a Dominic who would be disoriented, reactive, scrambling. The Dominic standing 20 feet away in a cracked asphalt lot was none of those things. He was cold and present and had done his thinking in the car on the way here. Salazar spoke into the radio again. Mason came out 30 seconds later, walked out by a man Dominic didn't recognize, and when the boy saw his father, he crossed the 20 feet between them at a run, and Dominic went down to one knee on the broken asphalt and caught him. Mason was shaking, not crying. The tears had probably already happened inside in whatever room they'd been kept in, but shaking with the fine, constant tremor of a child whose body had been running on adrenaline for 2 hours and was only now allowing itself to register that something safe was nearby. He pressed his face against Dominic's shoulder, and Dominic held him with both arms and felt the shaking and said nothing because there was nothing to say that would be adequate, and he knew it. He held his son for a moment. One moment, complete and unambiguous, in the middle of a situation that was going to require him to be something other than a father in approximately 60 seconds. Then he straightened up and kept one hand on Mason's shoulder and looked at Salazar. "Inside," Salazar said. He tilted his head toward the secondary building. "We finished this." Dominic walked Mason back to Elena. He looked at her, directly, fully, the kind of look they hadn't exchanged in years, something without performance or management in it. "Stay right here," he said, "both of you." Elena looked at him with those complicated eyes. She read him the way she always read him. "Dominic, I'll be 5 minutes." He held her gaze for one more beat. "I'm going to fix this." He followed Salazar inside. The interior of the secondary building smelled like old paper and rust, and the particular closeness of a space that hadn't been properly ventilated in years. A hallway, doors on both sides, ceiling low enough that Dominic was aware of it. Salazar led him to the far end, into what had been a conference room, rectangular table, 4 chairs, one window painted over, a single work light someone had brought in and set up in the corner. 2 of Salazar's men came in behind Dominic. He tracked them by sound, left and right, staying near the door. He noted their positions and did not look at them. Salazar sat down across the table. He had a folder in front of him. He opened it. Inside, a document. Several pages. The kind of formal internal agreement the organization used for transfers of authority. He slid it across the table. Dominic looked at it without touching it. He could see his name at the top and Salazar's name below, and the structure of the language. Voluntary cessation, acknowledgement of transition, transfer of all operational authority. The whole architecture of surrender on 4 pages. "Sign it," Salazar said. "You take your family out of here and you go wherever you want to go, and this is over." Dominic looked at the document. He thought about 20 years. He thought about his father and the thing he'd inherited and then expanded and what it had cost. In every currency available to cost things in time, presence, whatever he might have been without it, whatever Elena might have been, whatever Mason was going to be. He thought about the question in the kitchen on a rainy night. He thought about standing in the hallway and hearing it, how it had gone through all of it, like the question was a wire, and he was the thing it cut. He picked up the pen that Salazar had placed beside the document. He looked at Salazar across the table. "There's something I need to tell you first." Salazar waited. "Reyes isn't missing," Dominic said. A pause. "What?" "Reyes came to me 10 days ago, before you knew he was going to. He'd figured out the shape of what you were building. Not all of it, but enough. He brought me the Hartfield connection and the timeline and the personnel file on Harmon. I told him to disappear." Dominic set the pen down on the table. "He's not missing, Rico. He's somewhere safe, with documentation of everything you've built over the last 2 years. Every account, every contact, every arrangement you made without my knowledge. And if I don't make a call in the next—" He looked at his watch. 18 minutes. That documentation goes to 3 separate people who will know exactly what to do with it." The room was very still. Salazar's face had not changed. The surface of it had not changed. But something underneath had. Dominic could see it, the way you see a change in water when something moves below the surface. The displacement that travels upward without the thing itself being visible. "You're bluffing," Salazar said. "Call it." Silence. "Reyes was careful," Dominic said. "You knew he was careful. That's why you moved on him. You identified him as the most likely leak, and you moved before he could get to me. But you moved 2 days too late." He held Salazar's gaze. "You spent 2 years building this. You planned the timing, the personnel, the documentation. You were meticulous, and you made one mistake. You assumed that because I was distracted by my family, I was distracted completely. You didn't account for the possibility that I had been watching you watch me." Salazar's jaw was tight now. The performance of composure was costing him something you could see, and "Here's what happens," Dominic said. "You're going to release my family. You're going to stand down your men, and then you and I are going to have a real conversation about how this ends. Not on paper, not in this room, and not on your terms." He pushed the unsigned document back across the table. "Because if you push this further, the documentation releases. And what comes after that is not something either of us is going to enjoy." One of the men by the door shifted his weight. Dominic heard it. Salazar heard it too. He made a small gesture with his hand. "Stop," without breaking eye contact with Dominic. Then he sat back. He picked up the document. He looked at it for a moment in the way a man looks at a thing he spent a long time building and is calculating the cost of releasing. "You would burn it down," Salazar said. "Your own organization." "I would burn down whatever needs burning." Dominic stood up. "I spent 20 years building it. I know where every piece is. You spent 2 years studying it. You know where some of them are." He held the man's eyes one final time. "Go ahead and do that math." He walked to the door. The men there did not move. Salazar said nothing. Dominic walked through the door and down the hallway and out into the flat gray daylight where Elena and Mason were standing by the car, and he walked to them and put his hand on his son's back and said, "We're going." He heard behind him the sound of Salazar's voice, low, controlled, speaking to someone, and then the sound of the men in the lot beginning to move. He tracked all of it. He walked Elena and Mason to the car and got them inside and got in after them, and Marco pulled out of the lot without being told to. On the service road through the trees, Elena turned to look at him. Mason was between them, pressed against Dominic's side, still trembling faintly, face turned into his father's shoulder. "Is it over?" Elena asked. Dominic looked through the rear window at the industrial structure diminishing through the trees. Salazar was standing in the lot. He could see him, small at this distance, still, watching the car go. "No," Dominic said. He turned back and looked at the road ahead and put his arm around his son. It was not over. He had bought hours, maybe a day. The bluff. And parts of it were bluff. Reyes was real, but the documentation was incomplete. The 18-minute window was constructed. The 3 people were a fiction he'd built in the car on the way here from the bones of a truth. Had bought him time and nothing else. Salazar would spend the next 12 hours running it down, finding the gaps, calculating what was real, When he found the gaps, he would move. Faster this time. With no more interest in a clean transition and no further use for leverage he couldn't safely hold. Which meant Dominic had until Salazar finished his calculation. He looked at his son's dark hair pressed against his shoulder. He looked at Elena's hands in her lap, the knuckles not white anymore, but her fingers tightly interlaced, holding on to each other because there was nothing else available to hold on to. He thought about a kitchen on a rainy night, and a question that had cracked something open, and about how the crack had let things in, and how those things had changed him in ways that were now irreversible, that he could not unfeel or unsee or put back behind whatever wall he'd kept them behind for the first 8 years of his son's life. He thought about what came next and understood that what came next required a version of him that did not exist yet. Not the man who had built the empire. Not the man who had stood in the hallway and heard a question and been broken by it. Something between those two things, and harder than both of them. Something that could act with the full force of what he'd spent 20 years becoming and be doing it, this time, for something that actually mattered. He looked at the road. He looked at his son. He pulled out his phone and called the one man he hadn't called yet. The man he'd been hoping, until approximately 40 minutes ago, he would never need to call. The man who existed at the intersection of the world. Dominic was in, and the world outside it. The man who owed him something significant and had been waiting years for Dominic to collect. The phone rang twice. Then a voice he hadn't heard in 3 years said, "Beskari." "I need to see you tonight," Dominic said. A pause. "How bad?" Dominic looked at his son. "Bad enough," he said. The man Dominic called was named Garrett Hale. I was 53 years old, lived in a house outside Stamford that looked like a retired school teacher's house. Single story, wood siding, a garden in the back that he actually maintained. And he had spent 22 years as a federal organized crime investigator before taking early retirement under circumstances that were officially described as health-related and were not. Dominic had met him 11 years ago on opposite sides of a situation that had ended without charges being filed. And in the process of that ending, each man had acquired enough information about the other to make the relationship permanent in the way that only mutual leverage makes things permanent. Hale had called it a détente. Dominic had called it an arrangement. They had not spoken in 3 years. Hale opened his front door before Dominic reached it, which meant he'd been watching from inside, which meant the call had put him on alert. He looked at Dominic, then past him at the car in the driveway where Marco sat engine running, and then at Dominic again. "Come in," he said. They sat at Hale's kitchen table. The kitchen smelled like coffee and wood polish, and the particular cleanliness of a space maintained by someone who lived alone and had made peace with it. Hale poured 2 cups of coffee that Dominic didn't drink and sat across from him with his forearms on the table and listened while Dominic laid it out. All of it. Not a selected version. The full architecture, Salazar's timeline, the personnel operation, the kidnapping, the document, the bluff. He left out nothing that was relevant, and he said it in the flat sequential way he'd always delivered information to people who needed to act on it. Hale listened without interrupting. He'd always been good at that. The specific skill of receiving information without reacting to it, absorbing it, and processing it below the surface while his face stayed level. It was one of the things that had made him effective for 22 years, and it was one of the things, Dominic had always privately thought, that had also made him something other than entirely human to be across from. When Dominic finished, Hale looked at his coffee cup for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need?" "Salazar has 6 people at a staging location. Different from the steel plant. He'll have moved after I left. I need to know where he is by morning." "And then?" "And then I need 24 hours. 4. To finish it." Hale looked at him. "Finish it how?" "Clean." Dominic held his gaze. "I'm not going to war with him. I'm going to remove him from the equation in a way that doesn't require a body count. But I need the location, and I need the 24 hours to run without interference from anyone in your world who might get curious about unusual movement in the corridor." Hale sat with this. He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the table, then back. An old habit. Dominic had seen it before. "What you're describing is still a crime. Several. And you're asking me to look away. I'm calling in the thing you owe me." Dominic said it simply, without heat. "That's all this is." Hale was quiet for a long moment. Outside, somewhere down the street, A dog was barking at something and then wasn't. The refrigerator in the corner hummed. "I can get you the location by 4 in the morning," Hale said. "The 24 hours I can manage, but not more than that. After 24 hours, I can't control what other people notice. That's enough. Dominic." Hale stopped him before he stood. "After this. Whatever you have left, the organization, the network, the accounts, it needs to get very small, very fast. You understand what I'm saying?" Dominic understood. "Yeah. I'm not saying disappear. I'm saying make it small enough that nobody with a federal budget has a professional reason to care about it anymore." "I hear you." He left Hale's house at 11:47. He drove to the safe house, a property held under a name that existed only on paper, that Salazar did not know about because Dominic had acquired it 6 years ago through a channel that didn't touch the organization's usual infrastructure. One of a small number of things he'd kept entirely outside the shared architecture of the enterprise, precisely because men who run large organizations learn early that there are things you don't share, not out of paranoia, but out of the same instinct that makes you keep a spare key somewhere only you know about. Elena and Mason were there with Pettit, who had gotten them from the car while Dominic was inside with Hale. The safe house was a 2-bedroom unit above a dry cleaning business in a neighborhood that was ordinary enough to be invisible. Mason was asleep on the couch with his jacket over him by the time Dominic arrived, one arm hanging off the edge, the fine trembling finally gone from his body. Pettit was at the window with his jacket open and his eyes on the street below. Elena was at the small kitchen table with a glass of water she hadn't touched. She looked up when Dominic came in. She looked at him for a long time with those gray and watchful eyes, and then she said, "Tell me what's happening." He sat down across from her and told her. Not everything, not Hale, not the full shape of the plan, but enough. Enough that she wasn't operating in the dark. She deserved that much. She'd been operating in the dark for 9 years, and it had cost her things he was only beginning to fully calculate. She listened the way Hale had listened, without interrupting. Though where Hale's listening had been professional, Elena's was different. There was something underneath it, a processing that was not just strategic, that was also personal, that was running the information through the lens of 9 years of marriage to a man who was telling her now what he'd been too absent to tell her before. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mason asked me in the car if you were going to come." "What did you tell him?" "I told him yes." She looked at her water glass. "I wasn't sure it was true when I said it. It was true. I know that now." She looked up. "What happens after?" "After is different," he said. "After is smaller. After is—" He stopped, found the word. "After is just us." She looked at him with the expression she'd had at the dinner table the night Mason explained the water cycle, that careful, complicated thing, the hope that had learned to be cautious of itself. "You mean that?" "I mean it." She nodded once. She picked up the water glass and drank from it, which was the closest thing to an answer she gave him, and he took it. Hale's message came at 3:58 in the morning. An address, a commercial property in the industrial corridor south of the city, a former bottling plant that had been purchased 18 months ago through a shell company that Hale's people had run down in 4 hours, which told Dominic that Salazar's financial architecture, whatever its other qualities, had not been built to withstand serious federal scrutiny. That was useful information for later. Right now it was a location. He went with Marco, Petit, Carver, and Diaz. 5 men. He'd considered more and decided against it. More men meant more movement meant more visibility, and visibility was the enemy of what he needed to do in the next 6 hours before Stamford woke up and started paying attention. They took 2 cars. Dominic was in the first with Marco, going through what they knew about the building while Marco drove, floor plan pulled from county records, single main entrance on the south face, loading dock on the east, 3 possible secondary exits. Old structure, brick and steel, the kind that had been built to last and had outlasted its purpose by 30 years. They stopped 2 blocks out and walked the last distance. The bottling plant had a chain-link fence around the perimeter that was old enough that 2 sections of it had pulled away from the posts and could be pushed back. Dominic went through first. The ground inside the fence was broken concrete and scrub grass, and the particular debris of an abandoned industrial space, broken glass, rusted metal components, a collapsed section of roofing that had come down at some point and been left where it fell. They moved along the building's north face, away from the street, in the dark. No lights on this side. The south face had two high windows with light behind them, pale and artificial, the kind of light work lamps make. Someone was awake inside. Dominic counted the vehicles in the south lot from the corner of the building. 3. Same as the steel plant. Possibly the same people, relocated. He signaled to Petit, east side, and Petit and Diaz peeled away toward the loading dock. He signaled Marco and Carver to stay at the corner, then he moved to the south entrance alone. He stood at the entrance for a moment. Plain steel door, no handle on the outside, the kind that opened from within. He knocked. The sound of it was wrong for the situation, and he knew it. A man knocking at a door in the dark outside an abandoned factory at 4 in the morning was absurd in a way that worked in his favor, because it was absurd enough that the man on the other side of the door would open it just to understand what he was looking at. The door opened, and one of Salazar's men, not one Dominic recognized, young, hard-faced, hand already moving toward his jacket. Dominic hit him once, hard and precise, in the throat. The man went down making no sound worth mentioning, and Dominic caught him on the way and lowered him rather than let him fall, because falling makes noise and noise traveled in empty buildings. He went inside. The bottling plant's interior was a large open floor with the remnants of the production line still in place. Long metal frames running the length of the space, conveyor systems frozen in their last position. The work lamps were at the far end, 3 of them on stands, creating a pool of harsh light in the surrounding dark. Salazar was in that light, at a folding table with 2 laptops and another man. Dominic didn't recognize, and 2 more of his people visible in the peripheral dark, posted at positions that covered the south entrance from the inside. They'd covered the south entrance. They'd apparently not considered that anyone would come through it the way Dominic had, or that the loading dock on the east side might also be a point of entry. Dominic heard the loading dock door 20 seconds before Salazar did. Salazar heard it at the same moment. His 2 peripheral men started moving, and by then, Petit and Diaz were already inside, and the geometry of the room had changed completely. Salazar stood up fast, chair scraping concrete. His hand went to his hip. Dominic was already crossing the floor toward him. "Don't," Dominic said. Salazar's hand stopped. He looked at Dominic coming across the dark factory floor, and in the harsh work lamp light, his face was, for the first time in 14 years, not composed. The still water surface had broken. What was underneath it was not fear exactly, or not only fear, it was the expression of a man who had run his calculations correctly in every direction except one, and was only now identifying which direction he'd missed. The man beside Salazar at the table reached for something. Carver, who had come through the south door behind Dominic, got there first. Brief. Physical. The man sat down on the concrete floor and stayed there. Salazar's remaining 2 men looked at the situation, Petit and Diaz on the east, Marco covering the south, Carver already inside, Dominic 6 feet away, and made the calculation that people make when the math stops working in their direction. They didn't drop their weapons, but they stopped moving, which was the practical equivalent. Salazar looked at Dominic. His jaw was tight. His hands were at his sides now, away from his hip. "Reyes," he said. "Reyes is real," Dominic said. "The documentation is mostly real. The timeline I gave you was compressed. You bought yourself one night." "I bought myself enough." Dominic stopped 3 feet from him. Up close, in the work lamp light, he could see the specific exhaustion in Salazar's face, the kind that came not from a single sleepless night, but from months of sustained tension, the cost of carrying a large secret for a long time. He'd been living inside this plan for at least 2 years. That was 2 years of performing normalcy while building something underneath it. Even for a man as controlled as Salazar, that left marks. "Here's what's going to happen," Dominic said. "You're going to sit down, and you're going to tell me every name, every person you brought into this, inside the organization and outside it. Every arrangement you made, every account you opened, every contact you used, all of it. And if I don't, then Reyes's documentation goes where I said it was going. And instead of being the man who made a move and lost, you're the man who handed 22 people to federal investigators." Dominic held his eyes. "You know the difference between those 2 things." Salazar knew. In this world, losing a power play was survivable. in the various senses of the word, survivable. Being the source of a federal case was not, in any sense, survivable. He sat down. He talked for 2 hours. Dominic stood and listened, and Marco wrote, filling 3 pages of a notebook in the small, precise handwriting he used for things that needed to be kept. Salazar's voice started tight and controlled, and by the end of the first hour, it had flattened into something that was neither controlled nor emotional, just functional. The voice of a man emptying a room because the room had to be emptied. What came out was larger than Dominic had fully anticipated. The operation Salazar had built used the organization's infrastructure as scaffolding, but was not the organization. It was a parallel structure built inside the existing one, the way a parasite builds inside a host, using the host's resources to grow something the host doesn't know is there. Names. Dominic recognized. Names he didn't. Financial arrangements that had been running for 18 months. 3 people inside the organization who had been turned, not by money, in 2 of the 3 cases, but by information Salazar had acquired about them and applied with precision. One of those 3 names landed on Dominic like a physical impact. Carver. Salazar said it plainly, without inflection, looking at the table rather than at the man standing 10 feet behind Dominic's left shoulder. He said it the way you say a fact that is just a fact, stripped of anything else. Dominic did not look at Carver. He heard, behind him, the absolute stillness of a man who knows his name has just been said in a room where it was going to cost him. "How long?" Dominic said. 8 months, Salazar said. "What did you give him?" "Information about what happened to his brother." A pause. "The Mercer situation, 3 years ago. His brother was involved in the peripheral. He wanted to know. I gave him a version of it that pointed in a useful direction." Dominic turned. Carver was standing 6 feet away with his weapon at his side and his face doing something complicated that resolved, as Dominic watched, into something that was not quite shame and not quite defiance, but that contained both. He was 40 years old, broad-shouldered, had been with the organization for 7 years. Dominic had trusted him with his location tonight. "Give Pettit the weapon," Dominic said. Carver's jaw worked. For a moment, 1 moment, 2, the room held something that could have gone in a bad direction. Dominic watched him and didn't move, because moving would have suggested uncertainty, and he was not uncertain. He was exhausted and his chest ached with the specific weight of betrayal that keeps compounding through an evening, but he was not uncertain. Carver handed Pettit the weapon. "Sit down," Dominic said. The room reorganized itself. Marco finished writing. Salazar sat in the work lamplight with his hands on the table, looking like a man who had put down something very heavy after carrying it for a very long time. And in the flatness of his expression, there was something that Dominic almost recognized as relief. The particular relief of resolution, even resolution that was catastrophic, after months of sustained tension. By 6 in the morning, they had everything on paper. Dominic stood at the south door while Marco and Pettit handled the room. The sky through the high windows of the factory had begun to change, the darkness thinning toward gray, the particular cold light of a morning that didn't care what had happened in the night before it. He pulled out his phone and called Hale. "It's done," he said. "Clean?" "Clean enough." He paused. "I'm going to need you to make some calls tomorrow. There's a man named Salazar who is going to want to make a statement." Hale was quiet for a moment. "That kind of statement. The kind that takes names, the kind that makes federal investigators very happy and keeps everyone else out of the frame." Dominic looked at the gray light in the high windows. "He'll cooperate. He doesn't have another option available." "I'll make the calls," Hale said. Dominic ended the call. He stood in the doorway of the abandoned factory in the early gray morning with the cold air coming in off the lot and thought about what Hale had said the night before. Make it small. Small enough that nobody with a federal budget has a professional reason to care. He thought about what small looked like. He tried to see the shape of it, not the empire, not even the reduced version of the empire, but something genuinely different. He wasn't sure yet if he knew how to want something that small. He'd been large for so long that he wasn't sure he knew how to inhabit smaller dimensions without feeling like he was disappearing. But he thought about Mason on the couch with his jacket over him, the trembling finally gone. He thought about Elena at the kitchen table with the water glass she'd finally drunk from. He thought about a river poster rolled up against a wall and 2 hours of long division at a kitchen table, and a dinner where an 8-year-old explained where water goes when it reaches the ocean. I thought about what came next and understood that what came next was going to require him to make one more move inside the organization. One final consolidation, today, before Salazar's people understood that the architecture had changed, and that after that move, the organization would be small enough to not require a man like him, and he would be something else. He didn't know yet what that something else looked like. He had an approximate direction and a specific person to move toward, and he was going to have to figure out the rest as he went, which was not how he'd ever operated, and which was, he supposed, the point. Marco appeared at his shoulder. "Ready?" "Yeah." Dominic looked at the lot, at the thin gray light, at the chain-link fence with its loose sections and the cracked concrete beyond it, and the ordinary street beyond that with its ordinary early morning stillness. "Let's go." He walked across the broken concrete in the gray morning light, and he did not look back at the factory. Not once, because men who are going somewhere do not look at where they've been. And for the first time in 20 years, Dominic Viscari was going somewhere specific that was not the next problem, the next room, the next fight. He was going home. But first there was one thing left. One door that had to be closed from the inside before it could stay closed. He knew who had to close it, and he knew what it was going to cost him. And he'd been carrying the knowledge of it since the early morning hours, when Salazar had finished talking and the full shape of what had to happen had become visible. Marco started the car. Dominic got in and sat, looking at the phone in his hand, and thought about the name Salazar had given him in the middle of the list, 40 minutes into his account. The name that was not Carver. The name that was not any of the organization men. The name that had come out in the same flat functional tone as everything else. But that had landed differently. That had not gone into any compartment, but had stayed right at the surface where Dominic could not stop looking at it, no matter how much he needed to look at other things. The name of the man who had first told Salazar about the family, who had given him the initial intelligence, the first real intelligence, the thing that had allowed Salazar to understand that Dominic had a vulnerability worth building toward. The man who had been inside the house. Marco looked in the rearview mirror. "Where to?" Dominic said the name of a street. Marco's hands tightened on the wheel just slightly and then relaxed, and he pulled out into the empty early morning road without saying anything, because he understood, and because there was nothing to say. The street Dominic named was Aldrin Court, a residential block 12 minutes from the factory, the kind of street that existed in the middle territory between neighborhoods that had money and neighborhoods that didn't, the kind where people kept their yards maintained out of habit rather than pride, and where a car sitting at the curb at 6 in the morning didn't draw anyone to a window. The house at the end of the cul-de-sac had a light on in the front room. Dominic had known that it would. Voss Eyes, the security team shift lead, the former military man, the one who had called Elena's departure from the estate routine, the one who had let Harmon drive without pulling the file. Dominic had told everyone to pull on new personnel within the first 60 days. Voss was an early riser, had always been. It was one of the things Dominic had considered a quality. He told Marco to stay with the car. He walked up the front path alone. He knocked. Not the way he'd knocked at the factory door. Not a tactical knock designed to produce a specific response. A regular knock. The knock of a man at a door. Voss opened it in 30 seconds. He was dressed, shirt, pants, the careful readiness of someone who slept light and prepared quickly. He was 51 years old, 6 feet, built like a man who had kept his discipline long past the years when discipline was mandatory. He looked at Dominic in the doorway, and his face went through 3 things very fast. Surprise, a fraction of something else, and then the controlled blank that people trained in high-stress environments default to when they need time to calculate. "Boss," he said, "can I come in?" Voss stepped back. He did it smoothly, which told Dominic something. The front room was neat, military neat, the kind where things were placed rather than put down. A couch, a chair, a coffee table with a single mug on it. The coffee still steaming, which meant he'd been up for less than 20 minutes, which meant he hadn't been called yet, which meant Salazar's network was moving slower than Dominic had feared, or Voss was lower in the chain than Salazar had represented. Dominic sat in the chair. Voss stood. "Salazar is in federal custody as of about 2 hours from now," Dominic said. "His network is done." The people inside it who cooperate early will get some version of consideration. The people who don't, he stopped. He let the sentence end where it ended. I'm here because I want to hear it from you before I decide what the next sentence is. Voss looked at him. His jaw moved slightly. Some internal adjustment, some decision being made about posture or approach. Then he sat down on the couch. He sat with his forearms on his knees and his hands loosely clasped, and he looked at the middle distance between himself and Dominic for a long moment. How much did he tell you? Voss said. Enough that I'm here. Then you know it was before your son. Voss looked up. His eyes were steady in the way that some men's eyes are steady when they've already accepted the worst version of the outcome and stopped bargaining with it. The first contact was 18 months ago, before the school, before any of it. He came to me with information about the Mercer situation. Not about my brother. I don't have a brother. That was Carver's angle. Mine was different. Tell me. He had documentation. Voss's hands tightened briefly, then relaxed. From 6 years ago. The garment district, the alley, the man with the knife. The man wasn't who you thought he was. Dominic was quiet. He was a civilian, Voss said. Wrong place, wrong night, wrong kind of jacket. Salazar had the original report, the actual report, not the one that went into the file. He showed it to me and told me what it meant and told me what would happen to the people connected to that night if it came out. A pause. I was there that night. You know I was there. Dominic knew. He had been there too. He had been 29 years old, and he had made a decision in the dark in under 2 seconds. And the decision had been wrong in a way that he had been told the following morning it was not wrong, that the file said otherwise, and he had taken that correction because the alternative was to carry something he didn't know how to carry. He was carrying it now. Had been carrying it somewhere under everything else for 6 years. He owned you with it, Dominic said. He owned me with it. Voss said it without self-pity, just factual. The accounting of a man who understood what had happened to him and was done pretending otherwise. He didn't ask for much at first. Information about your schedule, which nights you were home, which you weren't. Routine things that I could tell myself weren't, that I could frame as harmless. He stopped. And then they weren't harmless anymore, and I was already in it. The school, Dominic said. You confirmed Mason's schedule. Voss looked at the floor. Yes. The words sat in the room. Outside, a bird had started somewhere. The particular early morning sound of something going about its ordinary life entirely indifferent to the room it was near. Dominic listened to it for a moment. He thought about Mason in the car saying Dad into a phone before the line went dead. He thought about Elena's hands interlaced on the table in the safe house. He thought about Voss standing at his gate for 4 years, running his rotations with the discipline Dominic had paid for and trusted. He thought about a garment district alley 6 years ago, and a decision made in under 2 seconds in the dark, and a file that had told him the decision was different from what it was, and how he had let the file tell him that because the alternative was to sit with the real thing, which he had not been able to do. He could not give Voss absolution for what Voss had done. He understood the mechanism of it, the leverage, the slow escalation, the way each step forward made the step before it irreversible and therefore made the next step feel inevitable. But understanding the mechanism was not the same as excusing the outcome, and the outcome had put his son in a room in an abandoned steel plant telling his father's name into a phone. But he also could not sit in this chair and perform a clean moral position about complicity and damage done by information you hold rather than act on, because the garment district alley was real, and he had been there and the file had not changed what had happened. Here's what you're going to do, Dominic said. You're going to write down everything, the same way Salazar wrote it down. Names, dates, the specific information you provided, and when. All of it. He held Voss's gaze. And then you're going to take that to Garrett Hale. I'll give you his number. And you're going to give it to him directly, not through anyone else. Voss looked at him. And then you're not my problem anymore. Dominic stood up. You're his. It was not mercy, and it was not punishment exactly. It was the only disposition available that didn't require Dominic to be something he was no longer willing to be. Hale would do with Voss what the situation produced. There would be consequences, real ones, the kind that restructured lives. But they would be Hale's consequences and Voss's consequences, and Dominic was going to put them in a room together and walk away from it. He wrote Hale's number on a piece of paper from the notepad beside the coffee table, the small domestic object of a man's ordinary life, the notepad that probably had grocery lists on previous pages, and put it on the table beside Voss's cooling mug. He left. On the front path, in the gray early morning, he stopped and stood for a moment with his face turned up slightly toward the sky. The light was fully coming now, the flat gray giving way to something warmer at the edges, the kind of morning that arrived without drama. He breathed in through his nose. Cold air. A faint smell of cut grass from somewhere nearby. The birds still going. He walked back to the car. Marco looked at him in the rearview mirror. Didn't ask. "The safe house," Dominic said. Elena was awake when he came in. Mason was still on the couch, still under the jacket, still sleeping with the complete unconscious commitment that children bring to sleep. Pettit was at the window. The room had the particular quality of a space where people have been awake too long waiting for something. A flatness in the air, a stillness that was different from calm. Dominic looked at his son for a moment from the doorway. Then he walked to the kitchen where Elena was and he sat down across from her at the small table. She looked at him. She looked at his face, read it the way she always read it, the scan that moved across his expression and took things in and interpreted them with the accuracy she'd built over 9 years of close and often painful observation. Whatever she read seemed to settle something in her, some question that had been suspended since the night before. "It's done?" she said. "It's done." She exhaled. It was long and quiet and contained several things that didn't need to be named. They sat in the small kitchen for a while without speaking. Through the doorway, Pettit shifted his weight at the window. Outside, the morning was fully arriving now, the light coming in through the kitchen's single small window and falling across the table between them. "Voss," Elena said. He looked at her. "You knew." "I didn't know, I felt it." She pressed her lips together. He watched Mason differently than the other men. Not protectively, more like cataloging. "I noticed it months ago, and I didn't say anything because I didn't have anything to say. I just had a feeling, and feelings about the security staff aren't—" She stopped. "I should have said something." "You should have had a husband you could say something to," Dominic said. She looked at him. Something shifted in her face, moved through it, and settled somewhere. "I'm going to dismantle most of it," he said. "The organization. Not all at once. That's not possible, and it's not safe. But over the next year, down to something that doesn't require what it's been requiring." "What does that look like?" "Smaller. Legitimate, mostly. Eventually. The real estate holdings are clean. There are 3 other fronts that are clean enough to build on." He looked at his hands on the table. "It means less money than we have now. Not nothing, but less." "I don't need what we have now," Elena said. She said it quietly and without the weight of a declaration, just a fact she was reporting. "I never needed this much. You know that." He did know that. He'd known it and had kept providing it anyway, had kept scaling it up, because the size of what he provided had been the only available measure of what he was doing for his family, the only number he knew how to point to. "I know," he said. "Mason doesn't need it either." She folded her hands on the table. "He needs you at dinner. He needs you to know what grade he's in and what he's reading and who his friends are." She met his eyes. "He doesn't know who his friends are to you right now. You don't either. You know that, right?" "I know." "Okay." She looked at her hands. "Okay." It was not forgiveness, not yet, not in any clean or complete sense. Forgiveness was a thing that took time and accumulation, that happened in increments over months and years of evidence, and Elena was too honest a person and had been through too much to offer it in a kitchen at 6:30 in the morning as a gesture. But it was something. It was the same thing she'd offered him when she drank from the water glass in the safe house. A door not closed, a direction not rejected. He would take it. He would take it, and he would try to be worth it, not in the way he'd tried before, which was to provide for it from a distance, but in the way that was actually being asked of him, which required him to be present in it. He thought about his father, about the man who had also been large and distant, and who had died in a hospital room at 67 with people around him who respected him, and nobody in the room who knew him. He thought about that room, and he thought about Mason sleeping 10 feet away on a couch, with a jacket over him, and he thought about how much he did not want those 2 rooms to be the same room. 3 weeks later, Salazar formally cooperated with federal investigators. The process was managed through Hale, who handled it with the professional efficiency of a man collecting on a very old debt, and was thorough enough that the resulting investigation consumed several people who were not Dominic Viscari and created enough noise in enough directions that the space where the Viscari organization had been became, in the relevant attention of the relevant agencies, a lower priority than the things the investigation had produced. This was not accident, it was architecture, and Dominic had helped design it, and it cost him things, accounts, operations, relationships, pieces of what he'd built, that he put in boxes and closed and did not look at again. Reyes resurfaced. He was given a position managing logistics for one of the real estate holdings, a legitimate position with a legitimate salary, and he took it without making a production of the gesture, and Dominic didn't make one either, and that was the extent of what passed between them on the subject of the months when Reyes had been the only person watching the right direction. Carver left the city. Dominic did not arrange what happened after that and did not ask. Voss's meeting with Hale produced what it produced. Dominic didn't follow it. He'd put those two men in the same room and walked away, and he kept walking. On a Saturday in October, 4 months after the night in the factory, Dominic was in the backyard. The yard was large. The estate had more land than any family needed, an expanse of maintained grass and old trees that had always felt to Dominic like an amenity he was paying for and not using, a feature of a life he was performing rather than living. Today there was a baseball in his right hand, and his son was standing 20 feet away from him in the grass, in a sweatshirt that was slightly too big for him, a glove on his left hand, squinting against the October light with the particular focused expression he brought to anything new he was attempting to do correctly. "You're gripping it too tight," Dominic said. "I'm not." "Look at your knuckles." Mason looked down at his glove hand, though the instruction had been about his throwing hand, which was gloveless, which meant Mason had misunderstood, which was fine, because they had time. Dominic crossed the grass and stood beside him and adjusted his grip on an imaginary ball, showed him the two-finger placement, the wrist position, the way you let the ball come off the fingers rather than pushing it. "Like that," Dominic said. "That feels wrong." "It feels wrong because you've been gripping things wrong. Give it 2 weeks." Mason looked at him skeptically. He was wearing the same expression he'd worn at the kitchen table the first night Dominic had sat down to help with math. The expression that calculated, that measured, that wanted to trust, but had learned through experience to verify. It was a look that Dominic recognized now as both reasonable and heartbreaking and entirely his own doing. "Okay," Mason said. They threw for 40 minutes. Mason's arm was not strong, but it was accurate once he adjusted the grip, the ball going where he intended it to go, which was a different quality than strength and more useful in some ways. Dominic said so and meant it, and watched his son register the specific weight of a real compliment, the kind that arrives because it's earned rather than because it's being given, and the way Mason's posture changed slightly when he absorbed it. Elena watched from the kitchen window. She was not watching in the way she'd watched from doorways for 9 years, the watchful distance of a woman who had stopped expecting to be included. She was watching the way people watch things that are actually happening, things that are real, present tense, rather than historical. She turned away from the window after a while and went back to what she'd been doing, because it didn't require watching anymore, because it was going to be there when she came back. That evening, after dinner, after Mason had gone upstairs with his book, he was ahead of the class again, reading something about ocean trenches this time, where the water went after it got past the rivers. Dominic and Elena sat on the back porch. It was cold for October, the kind of cold that arrived without apology, and Elena had a blanket over her legs and a mug of something hot, and Dominic had his jacket on and nothing hot. And they sat in the comfortable silence of two people who had come through something and were only beginning to understand the dimensions of what they'd come through. "He asked me something today," Elena said. "What?" "He asked if things were different now." She looked at the yard, at the grass still light-colored from the afternoon. "I said yes. He asked if different meant better. I said I thought so." A pause. "He said he thought so too." Dominic looked at the yard, at the place where they'd been standing 40 minutes ago, throwing a ball back and forth in the October light. He could still feel the weight of the ball in his hand, the small particular physical fact of it. He's going to have questions, Elena said, when he's older, about all of it, about what you did, what this life was. She looked at him. I won't lie to him about it. I'm not asking you to. I know. I just wanted to say it. She looked back at the yard. He deserves the real version, when he can hold it. As Dominic said, we'll tell him, when he can. They sat with that. The cold settled around them, and neither of them moved to go inside. Through the kitchen window, the light was on and warm, and through Mason's window upstairs, there was another light, where an 8-year-old was reading about ocean trenches and probably falling asleep in the middle of a paragraph about something that happened too deep for light to reach. His head dropping to the page and his breath evening out the way it did, full and complete, and without the restless small movements of someone who is carrying anything. Dominic thought about the question that had started all of it. Asked on a rainy night in a kitchen, in a small voice, not performing, not directed at anyone but the woman who had been answering its various forms for years. Why doesn't Dad love us? He didn't have a clean answer for why he hadn't. He'd tried to construct one, in the weeks since, and each version he built collapsed under the weight of its own insufficiency. The busyness was real but insufficient. The absence of a model was real but insufficient. The demands of what he'd built were real, and also a choice he'd made and kept making and had not examined until a child's voice in a hallway had made it impossible to not examine. The cleanest thing he could say was that he had not been present enough to love them in the way that love required presence to be real, and that the love had been there. He believed that. He had to believe it. But that love stored at a distance becomes a different thing, changes in storage. And what his family had received was not what he'd intended to give them, but rather what traveling that far had made of it by the time it arrived. He could not fix the years that had already happened. He had tried to find a mechanism for that, some form of retroactive repair, and there wasn't one. The years were what they were. Mason's first 5 years and his second 3 years, and all of Elena's 9 years inside the stone house, with the armed gate and the luxury cars and the silence. Those years were permanent and real, and not fixable. What was available was forward, small and present and consistent, and without the grandeur of empire. Just the daily accumulation of a man showing up for the people he should have been showing up for, small enough to actually be there and staying. He thought about his father's hospital room. He thought about the people who had respected that man and not known him. He looked at the light in his son's window. He was not going to die in that room. Whatever else he did or didn't do, he was not going to die in that room. Elena leaned slightly. Her shoulder came to rest against his, not dramatically, not with the weight of a gesture, just contact, easy and warm, the natural movement of a body towards something it had decided to trust again. She didn't make anything of it, and he didn't either. He felt the warmth of it through his jacket, and he sat still and let it be what it was. The yard was dark now, the grass pale in the ambient light coming from the windows. The old trees at the back property line standing in their ordinary darkness. An ordinary yard behind an ordinary evening at the end of a day in which nothing had happened except catch in the grass and dinner at the table and a boy reading about places too deep for light. There would be more days. There would be the slow work of what came next, the disentangling, the reduction, the construction of something smaller and more honest out of the materials available, which were limited and imperfect and entirely real. There would be conversations with Mason when he was older that were going to be difficult in ways Dominic couldn't yet fully anticipate. There would be days when Elena looked at him across a room and he would see the history in that look, everything they'd accumulated, the bad years alongside whatever they were building now, and he would have to sit with that and not look away. He'd spent 20 years not looking at things. He was going to have to unlearn that, and unlearning things that are structural takes longer than learning them did. But he was here. On this porch, in this cold, with his wife's shoulder against his and his son's light on upstairs, and the yard where they'd thrown a ball all afternoon, lying quiet in the ordinary dark. Here was what he had. Here was where he was going to stay. A month after that October evening, on a Saturday morning when the first thin snow of the season had dusted the grass overnight, and Mason had appeared at the kitchen doorway at 7:30 in his socks, looking at the white yard with the particular stunned delight of a child who has not yet stopped being amazed by weather, he turned to his father, who was standing at the counter with a coffee mug, who was home, who was there, and said, "Can we go out?" Dominic looked at his son. at the gray eyes, wide and wanting something simple, something that required nothing but yes. Yeah, he said. Let me get my jacket. Mason was already at the back door by the time Dominic had set the mug down, already turning the handle, already stepping out into the white yard in his socks before Elena called from upstairs that he needed boots. And he went back and got the boots and came out again at a run, and Dominic walked out after him into the cold morning and the light snow and the ordinary enormous life of it. He did not look back at the house. He went forward into the white yard where his son was waiting,